Hi, Nancy.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing great. Okay. Are things slowing down as we keep seeing in the news in the housing market, or is it staying pretty steady for you?
Oh, it is basically come to a screeching halt.
Really?
Yeah. I mean,
Wow.
there's stuff out there. I have a listing. I have clients who are buying new construction, but I have no buyers because what are they going to afford?
Oh, yeah, I hear what you're saying.
You know, basically their purchasing power has gone down by, on average about $100,000 compared to the low point of interest. So it's just brutal. Even my listing, we had to, everybody's offering money to buy down interest rates for buyers.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. So, it looks like, well, I'm just looking at a small little segment related to where my listing is, but it's anywhere from $7 to $18,000. People are
Wow.
offering and seller concessions so people can buy down their interest rate.
Wow.
Yeah. It's completely different than it was in May.
Yeah, I bet so.
I'm just grateful I've been in it as long as I have because it just is not a big deal to me. But for some of these young people just getting into it,
Right.
there's just no business out there.
Mm. Yeah, our daughter and son-in-law are wanting to upgrade from their starter home, and they're just put the brakes on it,
Yeah.
saving more money and see what happens.
Well, because they probably have a, 3% interest rate.
Yeah,
And then
exactly.
all their money goes into paying interest instead of into a bigger house.
Correct.
It's hard to rationalize.
Yeah.
I'm telling everybody, just don't even do anything till after the first of the year and we see what's going to happen.
See what happens. Yeah. Good advice.
Hey, Nancy, can you hear me?
I can, Matt,
All right, very good.
but it's not bringing you over as a panelist. I'm not sure why. But there you are. It looks like you are now.
Okay.
How are you feeling, Matt?
I'm doing better. Energy is back, and
Oh, good.
yeah, much better. Boy, just crazy though. It really knocked me down. So
Well, I'm glad to hear you're feeling better.
yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. You just don't realize, how you operate on a normal basis without times like that where you can't just do everything you normally do. So
Good evening, Chris.
Good evening.
Well done last evening.
Thank you.
Brian, I know we have a number of people that won't be here this evening due to the election, so the ball is in your court.
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started. I have a feeling this one will have quite a bit of discussion. So I say let's go ahead and get started.
All right. I'm having a slight logistical problem on my end. It's a large file size, but I'm trying to get it up and going here. There we go. Okay. Let me share my screen. All right. Does everyone have the title slide?
We do.
Okay. As Brian said, we'll probably have a lot of discussion on this. And if not tonight, for those that aren't there and can watch the recording at another time. So don't feel like you have to get everything in here. We're just going to cover the big picture concepts. Hopefully some of them were evident, maybe others weren't as evident. We'll point them out and give you all time to either comment tonight, discuss further, or think about them and kind of get back to us. This is chapter 5, housing and neighborhood design. I do need to apologize on your lists. We have chapter 4 as well, zoning and uses. That's kind of the final real substantive piece to plug in. I'm running a little bit behind on that, and it's mainly due to coordinating accessory use standards and uses with specific conditions. And so not much is really changing in relation to chapter 5. Other than the ADU provisions, which I'll hit on a little bit here tonight, and then just enabling the residential uses and all the accessory uses that go along with residential. But that the chapter 4 elements aren't that impacting on housing and neighborhood design, at least, other than the ADU one. So with that, we're here at our 4th major topic. There's the overall framework. And so here we're hitting on housing and neighborhood design. As I mentioned, it's chapter 5, but you'll see things that we've discussed in both chapter 7 and 8 revisited. And as I mentioned, chapter 4 is implicated some, and then the larger scale community design of the subdivision standards, mainly streetscape, and a little bit of open space is implicated as well. So we'll cover all those tonight, and you can kind of see the bigger picture coming together, at least in the lower chapters are yet to come. So when we originally met with you all and the technical committee, these were some of our leading points with the overall charge, and one of the main goals of this code update, more housing options. So the R1 districts, it was ADUs and small lot options. The R2 district, it was more small lot and small scale multi-unit building types. And then the MUR3 districts, the one that's intended for the largest scale, seeing if we can also get a greater mix of some of those small to moderate size apartment and mixed use buildings, a little bit easier or more clearly coordinated within the various MUR3 districts. Technical committee also, the technical committee is obviously lots of different departments that have an impact on this. So with design issues, they primarily deferred to community development. So no one had too many concerns with that. We did discuss some parking issues, and there are some concerns about not walking ourselves into parking problems as we densify. Fire safety and access is a concern as well. With mostly alley loaded blocks, we feel pretty good about that. However, fire department informed us they will not fight fires from the alleys, so we need to still be thinking of access and circulation with especially with larger scale or more dense projects within the streetscapes, and not be utilizing alleys for that. That actually spun a conversation at the technical committee to to make sure we're checking where some of the larger water lines that have greater fire hydrant and just water capacity in areas where we identify. So not necessarily a code issue, but making sure the long range planning is coordinated with that, and those are lining up with mainly the R2 and the MUR3 districts where the greater density is anticipated and planned. And then that led lastly to on all of these, we need to make sure we're coordinating utility updates and capacity along with applications. So strengthening some of the procedural criteria with that for new building projects was the, one of the primary topics there. So just a reminder, we've kind of revisited this graphic that as we move to wanting both a more design-based approach to regulation, but also wanting more flexibility. How do we strike that balance? So this is our sort of our construct of how we're doing that. So using a lot of intent statements and design objectives on the front end, trying to have as an objective and measurable standard as we can as the requirement, but then on the back end building flexibility through decision-making criteria, alternatives, exceptions, and then the variance as a last resort. And in fact, not using that process for some of the design issues is the goal. So when we see that reflected as some of the section standards, it appears like this. Again, the standard in the middle, that's what we're trying to hit, but understanding particularly with design standards that it's not always the exact right answer when we try to do something that's objective and measurable. So we want flexibility, but also there's alternatives and options that might do a better job than what we put in the code. And so we want to be open to those as well. So that will be leveraging on the left side of the screen in the procedures section, the administrative adjustments application, where we have some review criteria and procedures for that. Mainly it would be handled at a staff level, unless some of them are getting out of bounds of what we framed in the code for either the criteria or some of the parameters within which staff has flexibility. And then that staff would be able to bump some of those up to the planning commission as well is what we're working on. The section reference there, 16.210, is now updated due to some adjustments in the procedures. It's now going to be 16.211. So in your draft, I think you'll be seeing that, but we've been highlighting all of those cross references to make sure we go back and check them and coordinate them at the end once we have all the final sections going. But then in the substantive standards of Chapter 5, residential design, we want the ability to consider alternatives and have adjustments to all of the design standards. So frontage design, building design, open space design, and then the last two are attainable housing guidelines and sustainable site and building guidelines. The last one being similar to what we talked about last time, a couple weeks ago, with the non-residential standards as well. So we'll cover all of those topics. So key changes overview. Hopefully the section maps could clue you in. I know I kind of look back at that every once in a while and I realize they're written in a lot of shorthand and jargon to us because they're kind of our internal notes, so they might not be as clear to you all. So we'll try to do a better job of that going forward, of pointing out where the major changes are. But essentially, expanding building types. And so what that means is greater allowance for ADUs, greater allowance for small lot detached houses, and then more specific standards for small scale multi-unit buildings. So everything we're adding in terms of development capacity and density, we're doing so at a small and neighborhood scale in the hopes that some of the types of projects that people are most concerned with aren't the ones that are getting leverage from this code, but it's more of the smaller infill opportunities that are things that are more neighborhood scale, but might be actually a lot higher density than what the code would have allowed under the previous standards. And I'll cover that when we get to the table. Another key change is converting the lot coverage standard to a specific open space standard. Right now, all of the residential districts have a minimum or a maximum lot coverage. We're recommending changing that to something that's creating more usable active space, some things that activate the neighborhoods in exchange for that increased density or building capacity. Design issues, similar approach to what we talked about with the non-residential design, with the primary focus on how buildings relate to the streetscape and how they relate to the lots around them. And then some more general standards on some of the aesthetic and design elements, things that give the building's architecture character, trying to have as much flexibility and openness to things there, but regulating a few basic things. So that involves a new approach to the bulk plane, something we loosely termed a 3-dimensional setback that gives a little more flexibility than the bulk plane does, but in our mind still achieves some of the same goals. More strict standards for driveways, curb cuts, frontages, front-loaded garages, particularly on the alley served blocks. There's currently standards for that in the code, but we're recommending increasing them, making them more stringent, basically. Frontage requirements requiring entry features and transparency, windows, doors, fenestration on the frontage. Right now, those are both just recommended, or there's incentives to do those things. We think those are important enough that they should be a requirement, especially as you increase building capacity. And then more specific standards for articulation. That's something that's in the code right now, and you have what's called a menu option. In other words, do 3 of the following 10 things. They're not always exactly clear in the current section. So in our section, we've added more measurable criteria on what those things are, but still keeping it optional as to what things you do to achieve that design goal. And then the last 2 I mentioned, the bigger new sections, one on attainable housing and one on sustainable sites. And we'll get into each of those in depth. So that's a big picture overview. So I will start with the building types and the building type approach. Essentially, this table reflects not a whole lot of changes from your current code, and the things that we did change are concepts that are already in there. So essentially, there shouldn't be any wholesale changes to how development is regulated within these districts, except for 6 main things that, again, are all targeted towards that smaller scale project and building type. So I'll walk through those and point them out in the table. So the first is greater allowance for small lot detached houses. So again, these are building types that, due to the design standards and bulk plane standards and height standards, they're going to have to be a very moderate scale. In fact, you have quite a bit of these throughout the community, even in some of your higher density districts. And we think that's a good thing. It's giving people options to not have to build attached or higher. And then the more of those we can enable, the more small scale development we may have. Again, the 3,000, 4,000 square foot lots are in there right now. In most cases, they're simply in there to be grandfathered. In other words, because they're existing, they're allowed, but we don't want any new ones. So we've pursued the idea that we do want the ability to build these new, or even plat them new. But in the R1 districts, they might be in more, the L signifies a limited location. So end of blocks, corner lots in the courtyard pattern, which I'll talk about in a minute in those R1 districts. But in the R2 districts, we'd like to see these more generally interspersed throughout the whole range of housing types. So again, those are things that are in your code right now. We're simply increasing the allowance and making sure that they can be a more recommended type part of the mix, so to speak.
Hey, Chris, Judy has a question. Do you want to get through
Yes.
this section first? Or?
No, that's fine. Let's just go with questions as they hit you. So
Okay,
Well,
Judy.
it's more of a logistics. When do we want to discuss any changes that, or bring up any changes we'd like to discuss about, like the setbacks or any of that kind of stuff? It's more of a, what do you guys, when do we want to talk about that kind of stuff? During this section where you have this
Yeah.
grid, or in the other sections where we go into more detail?
If it's up to me, I would prefer to get through this first section, and then before I get into the design details, we can handle all the building type and development capacity questions at once, and then get into the design questions. I have a feeling some of them are going to be somewhat related, because the building capacity we feel is kind of restrained or modified by the design standards, but that might be an easier way to do it. The other option is I could try to, it seems like a lot of you are kind of already tracking with this, I can try and go through the presentation really quick, and we could just open the whole meeting up to discussion. I'm open to either. It's up to you guys, I think.
Andy's got a question as well.
I guess mine is more of a clarifying question. How do you figure out, let's say you're not subdividing a lot, how do you figure out which one of these rows would apply to you? I'm just thinking of trying to deal with variances on setbacks and whatnot on existing lots.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Because some of these do overlap, right? Like, so what if I'm a 6,000 square foot lot, but my frontage is only a certain amount of feet? Yeah, we plan on, our viewpoint on that is the frontage is the one that should drive it, because a lot of the regulations are keyed off of the frontage. So if you have an odd shaped block or lot and you happen to have extra area, that shouldn't kick you into that. So we're looking at either doing that as a footnote or interpretation issue, that the lot sizes are minimums, the frontages should be ranges, and that frontage would control which type you are, I think.
Thanks.
So I'll plan on getting through this development table and then maybe pause and see if there's a lot of questions. And if not, I'll try to get through all of it fairly quickly, and we can turn the whole meeting over to questions and discussion at that point. The second big change on this is increased availability of ADUs and multiple on larger lots. So the two largest lot sizes, the 9,000 and 7,200 square feet lot, could have up to 2 ADUs. The others would be 1. Again, they're currently in the code and allowed, but they are only allowed in R1C and above. So that's 2 broadening opportunities. 1, to allow them in the R1A and B district. And then from this committee's discussion, the idea was, well, the larger lots are really even more appropriate. And so maybe there could be 2. One thing about having 2 is we did not increase the capacity of both the building, bulk plane, and all of those things for 2. So you would still need to be utilizing your buildable space in the same way you would whether you had 1 or 2. It's just on those larger lots, you might have a little bit more capacity, and therefore you could have 2 smaller units or 1 large unit is the idea from there. The third change I mentioned kind of in the broad overview, converting the lot coverage to a specific open space requirement. So what's happened here is the required number has gone down, but what we count and the design requirements is essentially going up. Whereas under the lot coverage, any space that doesn't have a structure on it is counting. Our feeling is that's more handled by setbacks anyway. So if we have the setbacks and the bulk plane and massing correct, the open space requirement shouldn't be a third bite at that same problem. But we do view the open space as very important. And so that's more active, social, usable spaces. And then you'll see when we get to that discussion in the design, we then are counting some spaces that's structured or covered to that, because those can be active social spaces that kind of animate the frontages or give people an amenity, even if it's on building in some cases. So it's a different way at looking at that standard essentially, which is why the numbers have gone down. We're counting less of the space, but in doing that, we feel we have raised the bar somewhat on what we're counting towards that. The fourth change is a context-based exception for the front building line and front setback. We're tying that to the frontage standard. I've blown up what the footnote says in there, but essentially we're letting them be modified by an analysis of the context. You have this situation mostly on the end grains of blocks, the lots that front those. Some of those do have a fairly tight setback. I think we've measured some as low as 10, but in the modifying provision, we've said that front building line should generally be between 15 and 40 feet. And then you can gradually transition between them, a plus or minus 5 from the building adjacent to you. So the idea of bringing things closer to the street and streetscape is kind of tied to that idea of we aren't valuing that front setback simply because of space. We're valuing it because it's well designed and creates a connection to the streetscape. And so that can be done in a lot of different ways with the tighter front setbacks and some of the design standards we're talking about. And essentially that 15 to 40 range reflects the low end of your higher density zoning districts. Now you can see in the building types lower down the table, their front building line is 15 to 25, which is essentially close to what your current standards are for those zoning districts too. The fifth change is the biggest one. This is the addition of the new building types, or where they're currently allowed, at least clarifying how and which districts they're allowed in. All of these essentially get at one key thing that was running throughout all of your zoning districts, and that was the idea that most of them, except for one zoning district, had a 3,000 square foot per unit lot area standard. And so what that was doing, as we discussed in both the public engagement and some of the meetings with you all, at least in our mind, it was driving more land capacity per unit. And when people do that, they need to capitalize that land value. And so the buildings are getting larger and larger, even though it might be a 3-unit building, it's maxing out that space because the land is valuable. And so the idea of getting rid of that might get us smaller scale buildings. And so these are the ones that are doing that. The multi-unit house, which is essentially a detached house on the standard or medium lot. And although you already have the duplex, we're saying some of those buildings could have 3 or 4 units in them. And the multi-unit house could also perhaps have an accessory unit. So there it gets you up to 5 units in the same or similar scale building. The second one is the row house. We called it the small lot row house because we kept your current standard, which is the one below it, that larger lot that has the 3,000 square foot and the 20 foot per unit front minimum. Where we've studied prototypes in the area, and we're familiar with some of ours that go actually even lower than this, but we think the 1,500 per unit and the 15-foot minimum frontage is a good dimension for anywhere from 3 to 8 buildings. And then the last one, the small apartment building, 4 to 12 units, still a 3-story, 2.5 story in the R2B, although people are getting 3 into that 32-foot height limit, but a more generous 3-story in the MUR3 districts of 40 feet. And those heights reflect the current standards for the most part. There is a subtle change in one of them. You currently have a standard that says the buildings are 32 feet high as a maximum, but if it's a 4+ unit building, it could go up to 60. So that's quite a jump. Our thought was, let's compromise for this building type, and it's a very comfortable building type at 40 feet high, particularly when we get to some of the design and massing standards, which we'll cover in a minute. And then the last change would be, it's not directly reflected in this table, but it coordinates with the open space standard, but it's something we talked about through the public engagement and our early conversations with you, is the idea of arranging some of these around courtyards. You have some deeper blocks, you have alley loaded, both of those combinations lend themselves to the idea of arranging building types around courtyards. So this kind of gives you a flavor for the pattern. It's a good infill strategy, particularly when you're on the irregular blocks. And essentially all we're doing is we're saying we're giving 3 main advantages to this type. And I'll start with the eligible building types. Again, this is another one geared toward the smaller scale and multi-unit building types, but could also be very applicable to the detached houses as well. But essentially what we do is we allow multiple buildings to be arranged around the courtyard, and they can get a 20% lot size reduction. That number reflects the fact that they're all basically sharing the same front yard. So there's the efficiency. You're in effect overlaying what would be their front setback on top of each other. So if it's anywhere from 3 to 8 buildings, you're just simply capitalizing on that courtyard frontage as the common space. And then the lots are allowed to front on it with the reduced or no setback. And then in exchange for that, the courtyard standards have a higher design standard than just a typical front yard. So all of the landscape standards need to be allocated within that area or along the front streetscape. And we think we're looking at those numbers to make sure we want it to be that, but they seem to work out well with regard to the landscape standards that are required on the frontage. And then lastly, treating the sensitive edges that are a result of this pattern as well. So frontage along the street is just as important as it is in a single lot development. So the corner buildings on that front of the courtyard would need to be paying attention to that detail. And then the parking and access needs to be done discreetly. And so it's subject to the same standards as any project of that scale would be, where we're trying to limit driveways and parking in the frontage and having buffering and screening around any parking that's to the side or the rear. And again, with alley access, you have a lot more opportunities to do that well than you might otherwise have. So I'll pause there. That kind of concludes the range of housing options and building types. And the next part of the presentation was going to dive into the design issues. So any particular questions beyond those original ones?
Brenda and then Judy.
Hi, yeah, so I just want to make sure I understand this. There's really no change to height zoning, is that right? Except for the two smaller.
That's correct. All of the height limits that are reflecting in that table are mirroring the current height limits in all the zoning districts, except for the one case, and it was that one I mentioned where a building under 4 units is 32 feet, but the 4+ goes up. And so that's that one that we're saying, let's just make that one a 40. Now, what is changing, hold on to that question, because we'll get into it when we talk about the bulk plane, because essentially all these height limits, even though they're not changing, right now, all very restricted in terms of the bulk plane. You can there's a lot of cases where you can't even get to your maximum height limit because of the bulk plane. And so our strategy towards that might change some things in that regard, which I'll talk about in the second part.
Okay, and then Judy.
So just a quick question about the percentage open space. Is there, how did you come up with, okay, I guess in my mind, I don't know why the open space isn't all the same percentage. You know,
Yes.
and even if it's 30% or 25% for everybody, I think it puts a huge restriction on the bigger lots to be able to do anything interesting or different. And then always the front setbacks. I live in an area with large lots, and you know, it's hard to, I don't know. The houses need to be closer to the street, in my opinion. We ought to be able to have front porches. I mean, it goes on and on about what I think you ought to be able to do related to that, but I'm curious about why the open space is was there a number you were shooting for, an actual square foot, and then it just calculated out to be approximately those percentages for each size? I mean, I just did the quick math. They're, you know, sort of ranked differently, but I was just curious on the open space.
No, that's a really good question. And so we did get at that number in kind of looking at 3 different things. The first is we took your current lot coverage and just compared what we were doing with this to the lot coverage. And most of them right now, there's I might get this wrong. There's a 40% minimum lot coverage or maximum lot coverage. So essentially that's saying there's a 60% open space requirement on the larger lots and the detached houses. And that kind of started carrying down through the smaller lots. But it was also counting some of that non-usable space, so to speak. It was side setbacks or even parking lot landscaping was counting, but there was already a system of where you were kind of getting less and less open space, either on not necessarily on the smaller lots for the detached houses. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But when you got into the larger building types, there was less and less open space because it's a more dense zoning district that they're in, and therefore less open space is required. So the second thing we did was then we took that inverse and said, what kind of space is each of these building types lend itself to? And so the multi-unit types and the more dense types lend themselves to more formal, compact kind of social spaces, whereas the larger lots lend themselves to yards. And again, not that you'd have to do that, but we feel like the range of types we're allowing lets all of these types usually pretty easily get to this number on the houses, especially on their frontage and on their rear yard. Now, there would be some choices. I put an accessory building in, there goes that open space. I'm trying to make that up somewhere else. But we've gone through those, and we think we have better options with the types of spaces we're counting, because again, we're counting decks and patios, and in some cases on building spaces, some of those active spaces, whereas under the old version, those wouldn't count because there's a structure over them. That number should be a little bit easier to get to than simply saying it's unbuildable, unconstructed space. That's not to say that there won't be choices, but the original part of your question of why is someone else required more than the other, it's more reflective of what types lend themselves to that building type. So again, thinking of it real crudely, it's larger lot detached houses, it's yards, compact apartments, it's balconies and courtyards, and smaller formal spaces is why the numbers go down.
Okay, Brenda?
Well, yeah, I was thinking of the open space as a way of kind of preventing those slot homes that envelope the entire property. Is that kind of what we're trying to achieve?
A little bit. That's getting more towards what we're doing with the bulk plane, but it is related in a way, because the idea is every time we take away space from the building volume, we want to do it for a reason that creates a relationship to the outside space. So you're not just getting this leftover space. So if on those slot homes, the bulk plane standards force them to have a setback in the building mass for either upper stories or even the whole building, that would be a great place to make up your space by having an outdoor courtyard or a upper level balcony, although we limit what those can count. But it is a combination of whittling away at the overall building volume, but then requiring the outdoor spaces to be active and usable.
Kate?
Question, and I am just trying to absorb all of this, so I apologize. This is already covered. I'm thinking about the courtyard pattern and just looking at some of the kind of missing middle things to consider. And for the courtyard pattern, would we be encouraging basically, usually a courtyard pattern, you'd hope to have something that is an attainable price point, because you're sharing space, essentially exterior space with other folks. The way we have it drafted now, does this create the tall skinnies? So you'd have a bunch of tall skinny tower houses in a courtyard that may not be as inviting as maybe ones that aren't as tall and skinny, or will like the bulk plane and other things come into effect to prevent that from happening? Because it seems as though that can be just an easy thing for developers to come in and create, which may not be the most desirable thing for what we want.
Yes, that's a really good thought and a good question, and one actually that hadn't occurred to me yet, although we're always drawing the courtyards with the smaller scale buildings. You can look on this chart, they all have a 32-foot height limit. In reacting to your question, having not thought through it, the bulk plane is we're anticipating those being individual lots. So the bulk plane would apply to those. So even though they're getting close together, my thought is it's still going, the real tall skinnies that we've seen, that's, a 3-story, 20-foot wide building, or maybe even less, that's got a 3-foot setback, it's going to run into issues with the lot right next to it, even though it's on the same courtyard, because in our interpretation of it, the bulk plane is going to have to apply. So they'll have to do something to moderate the scale of that building. We haven't run through the problem solving of, is that too restrictive on the courtyard pattern? My first impression is it isn't, and that's kind of related to the scenarios we've run through in the bulk plan, which I'll cover in the design section. But based on your question, we'll take a closer look at that.
Andy?
I really appreciate the changes to the minimum lot standards for some of the multi-unit row house apartment. Are we concerned that we're not lowering them enough, that square footage per unit, or is really the width and the height going to be the more restrictive parts here?
Yeah, we've discussed this actually with root policy research on the housing study part. In fact, we discussed it as recently as Friday when I sent Molly Fitzpatrick the updated version of this. I had originally thought that we got rid of the minimum lot size per unit altogether on those types, and we're relying basically on the lot width and building height and setbacks. However, when I pulled this back up, I'm like, oh wait, we did leave them in. We just reduced them from 3,000 to 1,500. Her feeling was that's a pretty good place to be, although she was going to look at it again to say, well, maybe that ought to go away. In discussing that, though, I think the one that's going to always drive every one of these is going to be the parking requirement. It's going to either be your lot area, your height, or your parking. The number of units you put in all are going to still be subject to the parking, although we allow reductions and we've allowed sharing and different ways to bring that down. I think that's still going to be the one that drives even these smaller scale ones, where they may actually be having a larger lot simply to have enough to put the parking on it, would be my guess. We haven't run through every one of those scenarios though.
Yeah, I just see situations that might come to us on the Board of Adjustment and Appeals where it's still the number of units that are allowed, it's still maybe the width and the height, or the parking is all met, but there's just something weird about the area, and we're being asked to provide some flexibility there. If what we're going for is really the massing as a whole, I'm not sure if the area requirement is helping or just causing another hurdle in there.
Yeah, and we'll certainly take a look at that too, because again, her thinking on that was it might be beneficial to get rid of it simply to give more options in terms of some of the affordability points. I didn't necessarily have a problem with that because I think we're still, to me, the more important standard on here, which this question brings it up, is if you've noticed, we did put a maximum on the lot sizes. So, and that's again in keeping with that idea of let's keep these neighborhood scale buildings rather than some of the larger projects that can kind of, when it's just minimums, like they grow and grow, especially when there's a minimum per unit on there. So yeah, I think your point is probably on target, that may not even need to be in there if we can rely totally on the massing and scale problems.
Thanks.
Any other questions on the options themselves?
I'm not seeing anything, Chris.
Okay, we'll move into some of the design issues. And again, a lot of those questions kind of hinted at that, but get a little more comprehensive view of it. If you remember back from our engagement and discussion with even, what is neighborhood character, we emphasize that it's a combination of public realm. So what's the context you're going in, and we can do a lot to create neighborhood character with streetscape, landscape, and civic spaces. So that's still an important part. All of those things that are in the Chapter 3 subdivision standards. And so we're anticipating with a lot of these options that some of these things are happening as well, although they're not always required. A good example of that is, the streets that are shown here with street trees all up and down. You don't have that on every block, but there is a landscape requirement that's tied to the frontage that says, well, when you develop, you need to meet the landscape standard. And if your street doesn't have an area for a street tree, then that needs to move to the frontage. So we would expect to see some of these things kind of built in or improved over time, if they're even depending on the context and what's available in the streetscape. And then from there, it gets to the development character of housing types, scale and massing, and the frontage design itself to connect to those public realms. So that's the theme from which all of these design standards are developed. Again, almost all of these are ideas that are currently in your code now in one way or another. So on the left are all the things that you're currently regulating for, sometimes not in a coordinated way, and sometimes maybe in a bit of a conflicting way, or sometimes just on one particular district and not another, which caused us to go like, hey, that's a good idea. It ought to be in every district. So, this code update is an opportunity to coordinate all of those. And so we've done that by categorizing them under the three main themes on the right. And the biggest change, I'll go through some of the things where we're actually kind of getting a little more strict than you currently are. But the biggest one that's a new standard that you don't really have, as I mentioned, is under building design, the front entry features and the transparency. Those are currently implied in your code through either giving exceptions to the standards or strongly recommending them or allowing them to count towards some other requirement. But we think both of those are important enough that there ought to be a basic minimum requirement for each of those on the building design standards. So I'll walk through each of these ideas in depth here. So frontage design, we're dealing with the front building line. We kind of already talked about the front setback and being able to move that up in cases based on context, so that 15 to 20 to 40 foot range. And then driveway width, garage extent and location, parking extent and location for the larger buildings that don't have garages and they're going to be surface parking, or in the mixed use buildings where there might be structured parking involved, having some location criteria for that on how it relates to the frontage. And then lastly, the design of the frontage itself. And as I mentioned, that's going to be in the streetscape standards, in the landscape standards, and then the new requirement for entry features, which is in our building design group, but we'll get to it. So the big distinction we made here was alley served versus non-alley served. So obviously not alley served really shouldn't have any issue of meeting these frontages. And so what we did was we recommended that if it's alley served, it really shouldn't have a driveway and front loaded garage at all. All of the service should come off the alley. That's one of the, or not service necessarily, but all the car access should come off of that. That's one of the biggest benefits for serving that. And you don't have too many instances where you haven't followed that rule anyway, just out of the practicality out of it. But we wanted to go ahead and make it a code requirement. We did draw one exception that projects of a certain width and capacity could have a secondary circulation connection if it was necessary to the alley or necessary to the project that connects to the alley and creates a different outlet. So an 80 to 100 foot lot could have a limited access to the alley system on the alley serve. Then for the non-alley serve, the access width, we're recommending no more than 20% of the lot width should be a driveway. And then on the garages themselves, that if it's flush, unless it's set back from the building frontage, it shouldn't be more than 25% of the building elevation, or up to 40 if it's set back more than 12 feet. You can see your current standards down at the bottom of the screen in red. So you have standards that limit these things already. We have ramped them up based on looking at some of the existing patterns. And essentially what this means is that any lot that's narrower than 35 feet is going to have to look at some type of shared or common lane access. And those can happen even in non-alley situations. You can see a drive being shared along a common boundary, or you'll often see a drive that goes in and accesses 3 or 4 lots on either side if multiple buildings are built at the same time. But in each case, our response is there's other strategies than having each individual lot front loaded. And when you get narrower than 35 feet, you really ought to be looking at these other strategies anyway, because of the repetitive nature of driveways, garages, and curb cuts on the streetscape. So the narrower options are the ones where this is going to kick in the most. When you get to those middle range of 35 to 60 foot wide lots, you can still have your own access, but you might be forced into doing a single lane drive that then expands into a wider garage access. And then with the garage limits, your current standards are 45% max for the wider lots and 40% for the narrower lots. I'm not sure why it actually increases on the wider lots. It might be the idea of bumping from a 2-car garage to a 3-car garage that you would often see. But essentially what we came up with was the numbers of 25% and 40%. And again, it follows a parallel with what I mentioned on the driveways. The constrained ones are going to be the narrower ones, the below 35 feet. The ones in the 35 to 60 range are going to have to be forced to look at different configurations of how you do so to minimize the garage, but they can all essentially fit a 2-car garage in. It just might mean altering the building patterns. And then the ones that are over the 60 to 70 foot width begin to have a lot more generous use of space, and they can have more typical layouts.
So Chris, we got a question from Judy.
Okay.
So I don't live on an alley, so I don't really have a dog in this fight, but the fact that most of our alleys are unpaved, I actually don't agree that people shouldn't be able to access their garages from the front of their house if the lot is big enough. And I think that the driveway should be the same, whether it's an alley or a non-alley. Simply because not our alleys, if you listen to anybody who lives on an alley, they're unpaved, they don't get plowed. It's not like it's great access for vehicles. So like I said, I don't have a dog in the fight because I don't live on an alley, but I would like to hear some discussion about that for people who live on alleys. And then the other discussion I want to have, which I brought up before, is the things that the front entry stuff that I think you're going to eventually get to here in maybe the next couple of slides, but it specifically says basically I can't put a covered front porch on my house because it would go into the 25-foot setback. And I think that's ridiculous, because why wouldn't we want? Nobody in my neighborhood can put a front porch on their house. And we have these stupid little concrete stoops. Nobody uses their front yards because they're not conducive to that. And the fact that it's on a block by block basis, I think is also wrong, simply because why should or 5 feet related to my neighbor? So what I bite the bullet and get a front porch, and now everybody else can get a bigger front porch because now they're 5 feet off of mine. And I just think that there ought to be more things that you can put in that front setback. And the fact that it has to be uncovered is just silly. I mean, okay, fine, then what? I'm supposed to put a shed in my front yard to try and, because that would meet the code, right? So I just want to have discussions around that. And like I said, I don't have a dog in the fight on the alleys, but I think other people might.
Right. Well, I think I'll have good news for you on a clarification on the front porches, or at least for a big portion of your concern. So when we get to that,
Okay.
interrupt again if I haven't covered that fully, or if you still have concerns that we haven't addressed. The alley one, we've heard that concern before on the, be careful that we have a lot of alleys that aren't in good shape. Be careful what you say about them. But I hadn't heard it in that context. So I think I'll defer to the discussion on what you all should do. I think there's certainly strategies that can get at that, so it is more of a shared common access and resource. I think to not do that is missing a really huge opportunity that gives you a lot of flexibility for development. But I think you raise a good question on the ability to have a personal access versus forcing me to share off an alley. What's the right call on that? So I'll just defer to discussion of others, or, again, may not be resolved tonight, or there's maybe others that are here that have thoughts on that as well.
Okay, I've got Brenda and then Andy.
Yeah, so I'll be an alley person here and tell you kind of what's been going on in the scrapes in at least the MUR3 district, and also a block over, which I think is also MUR3, is that they're duplexes and they've been required by the city to pave the rear alley driveway. So at least I can't say that that's true of R1, but we don't have the kind of, a lot of those scrapes as prevalent as we do as MUR3. But I have about a 50%, more like a 70% paved alley now. And with the two new developments happening, they're going to scrape up the remaining homes on the other side. We'll probably have 100% paved alley. So, and like I said, I was told by the people who are building back there that that is a city requirement for these multi-unit developments. And that also happened on the alley of on Alati Street. And I think it also is something that they want to do it anyway to make these homes more marketable, because it's really hard to build this $600,000 home or more. And oh, by the way, when you leave your garage, you're going to fall into a giant mud pit. So that's kind of where I stand with that. I think that it's helping with alley improvement is my point. Done.
Okay, Andy and then Noel.
Yeah, I think using the alleys we have is really important. I think a lot of the discussion we have about the condition of the alleys has to do with trash, which is a hot button topic I don't want to talk about here, but those are big, heavy vehicles, harder to maneuver. I think personal vehicles, it's a little bit different of a game. And I just look at it from the perspective of a pedestrian walking down these streets. I much prefer in the neighborhood that I live in that I have options to walk down streets, that I'm not constantly looking for cars backing out of their driveway. It's just a better, more walkable experience, and it does offer some big benefits in terms of what people can do on their lots when they're trying to add on or redevelop.
And Noel?
Just based on what Brenda said, my comment was actually around these, we're really looking a lot at new builds for a lot of these guidelines or rules. So yeah, the paving of those alleyways as part of those builds, I think helps with some of that. I do live on an alley, and it is, mildly treacherous at times. But I think I always look at these as it's the long term. In 20 years we look back and see. I think those requiring the paving as a part of the condition of building is a good way to do that.
Judy?
I'm just curious for people who, so for the people that aren't going to scrape their house or build, if they want to put access to their garage from the street, that's not even allowed. So I don't know, maybe people don't want to switch it so they can access their garage from the street. But if I were in the middle of I intentionally didn't buy on an alley, so I guess it doesn't really matter. But if I were in the middle of a street that had an alley, I'd absolutely want to access my garage from the main street rather than being stuck in the middle of the alley, especially in the winter. But like I said, I'll defer to people who live on alleys. Just think they ought to be able to have a driveway to their garage if they want from the street. But
Brenda?
Well, I guess I don't understand that it's disallowed. And I'll tell you the most unusual thing about my block and being an old block from the 50s is, Judy, we have both. We have access from the front. And I had access from the back, and my neighbor can park on her front, although she doesn't have direct line to her garage from the front, but she has a little driveway there. I mean, I guess, I don't know why both it wouldn't be an option. That's all.
Judy?
So yeah, I'm just talking about the percentage of how much of a driveway you can put in. Like I said, I'm not going to argue it because I don't personally care, but I'm just asking if 25%, why the driveway frontage coverage is different, whether you have an alley or not. I don't know if it needs to be different or if that's the way you want to do it. But so
Yeah,
I'm
I'll-
willing to let go of alleys.
No,
I don't
I'll
care.
address that because I think it plays into both of the last comments. So the red down there is your current percentage. And again, it's frontage coverage. So it's referring to, it includes driveways, but other things that are covering the frontage, which sort of gets at your second point a little bit as well. But at least our interpretation of that standard is you're trying to be more generous for the non-alleys because they don't have any other access. So therefore they need a wider driveway or whatever. And then for the alley loaded ones, you're more restrained. We looked at, there's also a current standard in the, I think it's one of the MUR districts, forgive me, I can't remember which one, but it said that each row house can have a 10-foot driveway to it. And then units of 4 or more are allowed to have a driveway access on the alley. And in our mind, what that's doing, it's doing almost the exact opposite of what you want to do from a neighborhood design standpoint, because those are those attached narrower buildings and they're all now having a driveway, curb cut garage. And I think it was mentioned in one of the comments earlier, the repetitive effect of that on the streetscape. Every one of those is an interruption of the sidewalk. Every one of those is taking away at least one and sometimes 2 on-street parking spaces. Every one of those is taking away a space where street trees can go. So it's more of the cumulative effect. And so those percentages actually kind of work well for scaling it towards your lot width, because it truly is based on what's your impact on the streetscape. So the wider you are, the more opportunities you should have to do it, because it's not a cumulative repetitive thing. So that's why there is a difference. All of the right or wrong, I think, are debatable points for this committee and the planning commission and council to consider as well.
I don't see any more hands, Chris.
Okay. So moving on to that, so that was frontage design. Again, there's landscape, streetscape, and open space standards that will come into play, and so now I'll get to building design. This will get to that earlier point of the front entry features as well, and what can encroach into the front setback. But essentially, whether you're dealing with a large scale building or a smaller scale building, something more akin to a house, we look at these 4 elements: massing and bulk planes, something you're already well familiar with regulating. Front entry features, we are moving from not only allowing them as an exception, but actually requiring them. And so in requiring them, we are allowing them to encroach into that front setback even further than that front building line that was talked about. So that 25-foot line, or even if based on your context, you're able to move up to a 15-foot line, that front entry feature can still encroach even further into that. So there's an example of something that your current code would say, well, there's more lot coverage in the frontage and you can't do that, except that someone went in and said, well, we're going to accept that out and that doesn't count. We've taken a more proactive way of doing that, saying not only do we want front entry features, we're going to require them, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And in requiring them, that's also one of your eligible open space types. So even though it's a structure, even though it's covering your lot, there's open space that you should count towards your open space requirement. So there's another way that it's a little bit easier to get to those 40 or 25% numbers that were on that first chart as well. And then the last 2, transparency and facade composition. How do you break up larger wall planes? And again, you have a current standard for that. That's a menu item. We're just saying that the window percentage is a key part of that, and we think it's something that you should have a minimum for. So the first of those, the massing and bulk plane. This one might take, hopefully it doesn't take too much discussion, but we were struggling with a good way to graphically show what we see as a bit of a more flexible option, but also a bit of a way that raises the standard a little higher than where it might be right now. Because we know this is a sensitive issue, and we understand why the bulk plane is in place. But the left is your current requirement, and it's you're either starting at a 12-foot height at that setback line in R1A and R1B, or you're starting at a 17-foot height limit. And that graphic actually probably doesn't represent it as clearly as we want, because essentially what we did was we took that height limit and carried it from the front setback all the way back to the rear setback on a typical lot, and just assumed someone's going to build to that. So you're going to get these long buildings built all along that edge that forms a pretty solid wall, or at least building mass along that, because again, the idea of particularly on the smaller lots, the idea that people are going to use up all this space, we need to start assuming that. But again, it's a 12-foot starting point in R1A and R1B, and 17 in the others, and then a 45-degree angle from there. So back to that question of the building heights haven't changed. In most districts, you're at 32 feet of maximum building height, or you're at 40. You can already see how constrained those heights are, because you can't even get to 32 feet in the R1A and R1B unless you're at least 20 feet further back than the required setback. So 25 feet into the lot is the only place you're going to get to that. So on a 50-foot wide lot, you're never going to get to it. On a 60 or 70, you're going to get to it for a smaller part. So it's that kind of that tent effect that's going on in there. And there's some limited exceptions to that for dormers and things like that. But that's the effect of the bulk plane on those building heights. So the right is our idea, where we said if massing is the concern, and we've heard a lot about light, air, and open space, what if we took that number, so that gold portion of the current bulk plane, and we said you can allocate it any way you want within the allowed building height. So you could allocate it all the way back at a single story. You could allocate it part of the way back in the second row down at a multiple story. Or if you went all the way to your building height, you're not going to be able to get very far, but you could have a taller, smaller building. And then in each of those, we feel there's different options for getting light and air and access. And we might get better building to building relationships, and we might get more interesting massing of these different building types is the idea. So it's simply taking that number and saying, giving you an option to allocate it either lengthwise along the setback or height-wise for a smaller portion, but essentially all of them would have the same number. The next slide will show some of the nuance of the numbers we played with, and where I mentioned that we think we have maybe a little bit of a higher standard as well. I'll explain that, but we did that for the 32 foot scale buildings, so all of the R1s, and then we did the same exercise for the 40-foot scale buildings, and then we went ahead and even did it again for the 60-foot, even though those are usually an MU. The 40 and 60 are typically in the MUR3 B and C, but and the MUR3C, the bulk plane doesn't even apply. And so when we went through and did this for each scale of building type, we started to think, well, maybe it ought to apply in all of the districts, because if this is a good strategy that might work, it should apply to those larger scale buildings as well. So this next slide shows the table and kind of what the effect is. So the graphic on the left is showing that first range, that 0 to 8. And when you go down, the red boxes show what if you took a typical 135-foot deep lot, applied your rear setback and your front setback, you're left with about 85 feet of buildable width within the building footprint. And essentially your current bulk plane would say you could build to 12 feet or 17 feet, whichever is the case, all the way along there. And so that's giving you about 1,000 to 1,700 square foot of building mass in that 0 to 8 foot range. But it can only be 12 feet high or 13 feet high or 14 feet, depending on how far back you're going. So again, that tent effect. So what we're saying is, let's give you 2 tiers. The 0 to 8 foot range, sort of like a 3-dimensional setback is why we called it that. In the 0 to 8 foot range for the lower scale buildings, you'd only be allowed 800 square foot of massing. So a little bit less restrictive, or more restrictive than what you at least conceptually could build under the current bulk plan, which is this first number in red at the 12 foot level. But we are saying that you could go all the way up to 32 feet there. What that would mean, again, is that lower right, the lower left picture, you're only going to be able to do that for a short distance before you use up your 800 square feet. And then to capture the more 3-dimensional aspect is then when you got to the 8 to 20 foot range, so the rest of the area that's currently influenced by the bulk plane, before you get to a full building height, we give a little bit more of a massing. And so these numbers are based on that math of figuring out, A, what would be allowed under the current bulk plane, and B, let's start with a smaller number, but let them go higher. And then we did that for each range of area. And what that led to was then under each scenario, we did things like you see here. You can use it in all sorts of ways, whereas the only one that's currently happening is that upper, under the patterns and options, the upper left image is what's currently happening because that's the only one that really meets the bulk plane. Whereas all of these others could potentially meet it as well. And they may, it's debatable, but our thought is that might better serve at least getting different building options for sure. But it might also equally or better serve the interest of putting that mass in a place where it's going to have the least impact on the lot next to it and keeping areas that should be open more open. So I will pause there because that's our biggest kind of transforming concept, I guess, to put it in one respect. Any questions on that idea? Or one of the things I think we'll do is there's 2 questions here. Is the concept right? In other words, do we want more flexibility in the bulk plan, exchanging the height for length, and letting people choose, or giving guidance on where and when you should choose? And then the second would be, are our numbers right? And we think if they're not right, they're pretty close, but we're still doing some exercises to vet that on the larger scale buildings.
Brenda?
Yeah, okay, yeah, I like that picture. Thanks for showing that. I guess I'll just, I think I've spoken, to you guys privately because I am in MUR 3B. And I guess I want to make sure I understand how this would be less impacting, because we're a bunch of homes. Everybody imagine a bunch of single homes. And there is some tall structures around us. And I want to understand how a 3,000 square foot building, which is the largest you can do, and 60 feet high would be less impacting to the single family next door. Just explain to me like I'm stupid because I.
Yeah. So the first would be the MUR 3B is most likely going to be in that moderate scale. So what this would say is you're allowed 1,600 square feet in that 0 to 8 foot range. So if you went all the way up to 40 feet right off the bat to the height limit, you would only be able to go 40 feet back with that. So you would be leaving in that 0 to 8 foot range, you would be leaving another 45 feet plus your rear setback basically unbuilt, because no massing could go in there once you used up all your height. So that's essentially that lower left image there would be an example of that, not dimensioned in the exact dimension, but that lower left concept is there, that if you chose to use all of your max height, you're only going to be able to do it for a smaller distance. Whereas their current situation is they could go up to 17 feet along the whole length there, and they're likely to build out from front setback to rear setback at 17 feet high.
Oh, so it's like an incentive to build lower and get more square feet out of it. Is that sound right?
I would call it more of an option that if you go to the height limit right at the setback, then you're only going to be able to do that for a shorter distance. So it is trying to get things that are more open. I'm using my cursor and I realize, can you guys see my cursor, by the way? Oh, you can. Okay. So it's this area here that we're saying this could be the most impacting on the house next to it, especially if there's a house right here and this is their rear yard. This situation of having this be open and set back might be better than this situation of having someone just build a 17-foot building mass all the way along the rear setback, because the rear setback is only 20 feet. So they can technically go from the 25-foot front setback line all the way to 20 feet from the rear setback line at 17 feet. And so this is the other extreme of that option of saying, well, go up to 40 feet here. And if you're in the MUR 3B, that, let me back up a minute here. If you're in this moderate scale building where you're in a district that already allows up to 40 feet high, that first tier would say 1,600 square feet of mass only. Whereas under the current setback, they would be allowed anywhere from, in that area, they'd be allowed anywhere from 1,400 to 2,100 square feet of building mass. Although all of it at a 17-foot height, what this would be saying under the new approach is if they went up to 40 feet, this length would only be 40 feet long, because then they're already at their 1,600. So it would leave this space unbuilt and have a better relationship to perhaps a rear yard on this adjacent lot. Although the building to building relationship would certainly be more impacting, because they're allowed to go higher here.
Noel?
Can you help me understand what's happening in the picture you're just highlighting? If I'm standing at the front looking at it, what's happening on the left side?
Yeah, good question. So this graphic probably doesn't do a good job of illustrating it, because it's going to apply to the left side as well, right? So they're going to, what we would probably see, I don't know how, we focus on one setback to show it, but if we flip this, you would have to see the same relationship. So the building would essentially probably take more of a T shape, because it's applying to both sides. It's a 3D setback on both sides. So you would probably see that building shaped more like a T or something similar to this one here, that does that. But yeah, I would have to meet it on both sides. That's a good point.
Could it transition from 2 stories on the right side to 1 story on the left? And what would that look like?
Yes, that's another point. Yes, it can. And which is one of the reasons we chose the 8-foot threshold for when do we kick the second standard in, because what that would basically equate to is someone could set the mass back 8 feet from a 1-story to a 2-story, or a 2-story to a 3-story, could step back 8 feet. And then there could be some of the usable space in that area as well. An 8-foot depth is a small wing or something that a balcony could go on. But we didn't necessarily model that example. However, one of the other benefits of this approach, we think, is when I mentioned that it could lead to as long as I understand it's a height versus mass. Which are you more concerned about? But if we're more concerned about the mass itself, this might be a better option, even though people could go higher, because once they use up that budget, it's used up. And there's probably 20 or 30 more iterations of these patterns that could result. So in all of them, the amount of gold is with the area that counts. The amount of gold that's adjacent to that next lot is going to be capped at the same amount no matter what. So there's other iterations of stepping things back, moving things here and there that could certainly happen as well. We've only chosen to show 5 of them. We had another 5 more in our head that we haven't quite gotten to illustrate, but there's probably 100 more.
Are there other cities that have put this into place? And follow-up question, how has that been taken advantage of by builders
Yeah.
in a good way, bad way, either way?
Right. Both good questions. We have implemented this in one of our on-call planning communities, not exactly in this way. Theirs was more of completely different context, more concerned with tear down and rebuilds of smaller homes into really, really large homes. And so we used this strategy, similar strategy, not exactly this, to add variation to the building just viewed from afar. It wasn't used for any side setback relationship. So it's a similar principle. I have not seen this exactly done this way, so I can't comment to like which jurisdictions are using this, how is it being used positively and negatively. And part of the reason for that is we haven't encountered a bulk plane similar to yours, where to me, this is maybe a good option in response to your starting point of the bulk plane. But again, it comes down to the whole question of, are you willing to exchange height for mass? Because again, I go back to this one, all of these categories are a little bit less than what could technically be built in that range right now. Although in both of them, the height limit is the one that's the most, at least by your current bulk plane, is the most important. So going back to it's really this diagram.
And I don't want to drag this too far off at this point, although perhaps later, but I would be curious. I appreciate that a lot of what you've presented here has been, this is what you have, here's how we're not, pushing too far in any direction. But for a theoretical, for another city that is not Englewood, when you talk about this topic, what have you seen in the past, or what have you recommended in the past that looks different from what we're doing?
Yeah, that's that's tough to answer because it's a different conversation each time. I would say two things. Usually when we're looking at massing standards, people are doing it to break up the appearance of larger blank walls. So a lot of times the closeness to the side setback isn't necessarily the issue, but the idea of taking larger boxes and having variation in them is pretty common. And a lot of cities are doing that in different ways. I think the more unusual thing about, in our mind, about the Englewood approach currently is the idea that, in what I mentioned earlier, that yeah, your height limit might be 32 feet, but it's really hard to get to 32 feet unless you get a bigger lot and then put a bigger building on it. And so that's where I think the advantage of this might be. This is another thing that can help the smaller scale buildings on smaller lots, because under the current bulk plane, they'll never get to the allowed height limit.
Thanks.
I don't see any more hands.
Okay, I know that's a lot to dump on people too, so keep thinking of that conceptually, and then keep thinking of the idea of that trade-off I'm mentioning. Is it the massing itself, the amount of gold that we care about, or is it truly just the height? The second major element on building design is the entry features. And again, it's in your code now. It's currently suggested and given an incentive for, and we would like to require it. So what we've done is we've identified 4 different types, and we're starting to put the standards around them. We have dimensionally, I think we have the standards. What we're maybe need to look at is some of the design elements, particularly for this last type that we sort of added in at the last minute based on looking at some existing building situations. But essentially the idea is that all of these types are an option. You can do lots of different entry features, and there's lots of variations on each of these. They're like porches can have all different kinds of roofs. Porches can have no roofs. Stoops can be covered. Stoops can be uncovered. So each of these has a lot of variations within it of what you can do. And then we think each of them can apply to every single building type in different ways. And so this is where, in exchange with that massing variations that we just had on the previous slide, if all of the buildings do this one thing, in other words, have an entry feature, but do it in a variety of different ways, we could get a lot of interest to the streetscape. But the bigger thing is we're using that space well, and we're creating more active social spaces to it. So I'll leave it. I think that's the only slide on the entry features. Yeah, it is. And then we'll move to open space. But we do think that's an important requirement as well. And to the earlier question, these are structures that are allowed to go beyond that 25 or 15-foot setback, and even as close to 5 feet to the right of way, and can count as active social space, whether they're structure, whether it's hardscape, or whether it's green space.
Andy?
Would there be options to make these more accessible in terms of for people who can't handle the stairs, or are these pretty close to the patterns that would be required?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think in all cases we need, if we're not flat out required, I think it would be wise to say they can all be accessible, and probably all should be. We're familiar, again, that's a little bit of a design challenge, because you don't necessarily want the house that, I know there's really stringent requirements on what's wheelchair accessible in terms of grade. And so some of them could be extending quite far out. So we might need to look a little bit further about how you do that. The easiest one to probably do it is the porch. I've seen cases where the ramp up is disguised along the whole frontage, and so it has almost the exact same relationship as this, but the ramp is tucked in and goes sideways. It's a little bit harder to do it on some of these other ones, particularly if the building, the first floor elevation is raised. So there may be cases where some of them would be hard to get accessible entrance on it, and it might need to be to the side of the building if it's getting so close to where those ramps can't fit. That's a design challenge where we haven't thought through the exact results, but I think in all cases we'd need to be prepared to say, yeah, they all could and should be accessible.
Judy?
I just want to make sure, I have a vision for the porch I want to put on my house, which is what I'm speaking from. But I would appreciate it if there was a ramp, for example, on the porch, which is what I would like to see done on a porch if I ever get the one I want. I don't want it to encroach on the depth of my porch. So I want that to be in addition to the width of that ramp, to be in addition to the depth of my porch. So again, I know I'm just one person, but since I get to have a voice, I want to have the porch of my dreams if I ever have enough money. And I have the design in my head, and it would need to be in addition to that 12 feet. So, but anyways, I think it absolutely should be a part of all the entry features or allowed, but I don't think that it should be in addition to whatever dimensional restrictions we have on here.
Brooke?
Yeah, I just wanted to say there's definitely a lot of Federal Fair Housing Authority leeway, or actually requirements for accessibility. So, and I don't know those exact numbers, and I don't know how they would play into the setbacks, but any city has to comply and make things work. And in terms of the Federal Fair Housing Act. So that's all I wanted to say.
That's it for now.
Okay. Yeah, we will certainly take a look at the accessibility options and whether additional leeway is needed for that. Or that also might be a good criteria for some of the administrative adjustments. The one concern we would have is, I know, especially if everyone's thinking of it linearly coming out, sometimes those ramps, depending on how much they're going up, need to go out a long way. And so they can have a little bit of an awkward relationship to the streetscape and appearance. But there's plenty of options where they're designed really well and a major contributor to the front entry feature as well. So we'll take a little bit closer look at that. the last element is open spaces. This is a graphic from last time because, you know, it's the idea of spaces at a larger scale, public spaces, block scale, then down to the building and site. And so in the bigger scheme of thing, we're planning for all of these spaces to be linked and active. So it's a scales and networks of spaces. The bigger takeaway here is that we want to be counting the landscape and streetscape in the frontage, and then also the building spaces, some of those social active spaces, and make sure we're allocating those in a lot of these graphics aren't in a pure residential setting, but it's the same theme. So going back to the table that was originally our building table it was earlier in the presentation, that's on the left with that 40% number down to the smaller ones for the larger scale buildings and the more compact buildings. And then what we're counting. So everything, most spaces we went through and did the math on, can you get to this number? Most lots are you able to capture it with the frontage design, including the entry feature. And then for the larger lots, the yards, although some of the yards that maxed out their accessory building would have to find one of these other types of spaces if they chose both. But in all cases, we were able to get to these percentage numbers by using these different spaces. The one thing I would point out is that we did put a limit on how much of the either on building spaces, private balconies or patios, or the structured uncovered spaces, decks and patios could count towards it. But the entry features, per the earlier comment, those can be covered and encroaching into the front setback. All of your frontage landscape should count unless it's driveway access. So very similar to your current standard. So that was the idea with the flipping the open space requirement from a pure lot coverage to a more usable space standard.
Judy?
I was just wondering if it probably doesn't count, but I'm going to ask it anyways, but like a gazebo, so it's open, but it's covered. And I mean, that is, I think it should be count towards open space, but I mean, I don't know. It's separate from the house. It's open. It just has a cover. I don't know. It's just something to consider.
It's a good observation. The one thing, and so that gets to the you know, what is the intent of the open space requirement? Is it to, and it could be a couple of things. We're suggesting that we want to shift this more to active social usable space, and under that vein, yeah, the gazebo might count. There is still a part of this that's trying to deal with the massing and three-dimensional occupation of your lot too. And so the gazebo would impact that. And then speaking from experience in one of our on-call job clients that runs into that issue all the time, there is a slippery slope argument there too. Like, what's a gazebo? How many, you know, we're all envisioning exactly what you said. You know, we can see even maybe the hexagonal gazebo, and but there's certainly lots of iterations of that when there's a structure over it in the rear, we might want to be cautious of that. But again, I'm not disagreeing with the concept of, you know, should we be open to those ideas, because it certainly follows a similar principle to the types we're listing here.
I don't see any other hands.
So this is kind of a summary. We took the opportunity to sketch what some of these options might do. Again, we think they're fairly simple options, and they are options. Each one of those standards has several different variations that could meet the requirements. And so we went through the exercise of sketching them out on some typical buildings, and this is one of those sketches of what can be done even if you don't alter the building scale or mass. And so the first thing we did was on this particular one was, if we limited that driveway and curb cut, what would it do to this building? This is an alley access building. Secondly, a little greater transparency on the street frontage. Thirdly, putting the entry features on, whether it's a courtyard approach between the buildings, that's an entry feature, or some type of stoop that accesses even side entries to the side of the building, and then the landscape area in front used for more either aesthetic or social space. And then the last element coming in is more opportunities for improved streetscape. Have we taken that same exact building project and at least improved it in its relationship to the neighbors by some of these issues? We think we're on the right track. We hope we're on the right track. And this is just more of an illustrative to get you thinking of those ideas in the bigger picture. I had two more items to cover and then kind of just turn it over to open discussion. The last two are essentially the attainable housing guidelines. So again, we've heard a lot of this throughout, and we're in the process of coordinating with Root Policy that's looking at Inglewood's affordability issues. The concept we started with was, let's set tiers of affordability. So that first table is that idea, and it's based on one, what is your price point based on area median income, and then two, how much of each housing type are you providing? And so our first tier was, well, we want at least 10% that's below 60% AMI, or 15%, a greater percentage if you're in that upper tier. So again, the idea of trying to get different price points through a variety of projects. So the tier one is just a project that's going to give you one or the other. Tier two would be a project that begins to give you some of both within the project. And again, the idea is over time, the more projects you have doing either of these, the more options you're going to have over time. And then tier three was the one where we said, well, let's mix in that, let's not forget about that important category of the, that middle income level. And if someone did that, that's really the mix we're looking for. And you may not find that in one project very often. In fact, that's the feedback Root gave us, is they said tiers 1 and 2 are close, and they're looking at that, and they might do some adjustments, but they think those are both very achievable in the Inglewood market, and we may switch the numbers here and there. And Molly Fitzpatrick from Root will be able to give the more data-based response to that than I'm giving, but at least those tier ideas are close, particularly for tier 1 and 2. Tier 3 might only be larger scale neighborhood projects that can achieve that. It wouldn't be a single development project that could usually achieve that. So then the bottom table is, well, what do you get in exchange for doing that? You have two carrots to use. One is additional height, but all of the concerns that go along with that. And the other is a reduction of parking. And so that's reflected on the right. So we went through, and all of these will need to be tied specifically to whatever housing policy goal comes out of council. And it will need to be tied to specific benchmarks of how do you achieve each of these. But the essential idea is, let's give additional height or parking reductions in exchange for affordable housing. So this was where we took advantage of the 32-foot height limit that's throughout almost all of the districts. That can end up being a very good thing, because the only way to get above that in some districts is to do projects that are hitting any of these tiers in terms of price points or diversity of units within them. Root is helping us figure out what these limits would need to be, and they're facilitating some of those conversations with council as well. But I'll just kind of pause there for any reactions or observations on that idea.
Andy?
So is Root trying to calculate how much these bonuses and parking reduction, how much they help make up for essentially the loss of going below market rate? Because I'm seeing these bonuses as really important, especially when we're talking about maybe some of our most expensive land near transit. And I'm just afraid that some of the objectives that we've got, like locating housing for those more likely to be transit dependent in transit serviced areas. I don't want to see that objective weaponized to say, well, we don't need that kind of housing here, that needs to go over there. But then we're not offering anything to really make that possible in the locations we want it to be.
Yes, they're looking at both of those aspects. One of the things we discussed was, should this only be offered in transit served areas, particularly if one of the larger carrots is the parking reduction requirement? Because why else would we be giving a parking reduction unless we weren't getting people that were able to have mobility options through transit? That's kind of up in the air. I think Root was thinking that, well, we don't necessarily want to limit affordability to only transit served areas. But I think your question was maybe the opposite. We don't want to turn our transit served areas into well, we don't want that type of housing there. That's our best areas. I think we're leaning a little more towards the first part. And in fact, one of the things they recommended we do was these parking reduction rates. And again, these are all still very conceptual, as the right side of the screen is mentioning. But that being said, these rates here were our potential transit reduced rate for all parking. And their recommendation was this needs to be the reduced rate for affordable housing options in the transit served area, because it's such an attractive option and it's starting to match right up with RTD's requirements. And so for the non-affordable, the transit parking reduction isn't quite as great. And that was because they felt this was going to be one of the largest carrots there. And it makes a lot of sense to do that in only the transit served areas.
Yeah, I would encourage us to try and find spots that aren't just transit. Maybe it's just the development bonus part of it. Maybe it's a different level on the parking reduction. Just because I think there are other opportunities for people to go down to one car or no car that don't always rely on transit.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And that's consistent with what Root was telling us as well. So they're on the same page with that comment.
Kate?
I am glad we're looking at this. I'm wondering, in terms of like kind of the targets, I guess, that we're working on with Root, is this includes, I'm trying to think of, if you're meeting this and you're getting an extra story of development, is it possible you're only developing efficiency, really small, tiny apartments at the below 60% AMI? Are you serving a family that would be at that level too? So I'm just wondering if the units needed or the amount of people needed would match up with, what the density bonus or development bonus would be.
Yeah, and I'll try to find that answer, or perhaps the next time we discuss this as a group, we could get Root on, because I think that's a really good question. It raises the question to me of, I know AMI is set for different household levels, so I think we're likely to get smaller and efficiency units to hit this price point anyway, just because they'll hit a different market. But the question would be, well, if does a efficiency or 1-bedroom have a different AMI than a 3-bedroom? Because there are different median incomes. There's the median income for a 1 to 2 person household versus the median for a 3 to 4 person household. I just don't know if their median income analysis was that nuanced to look at the household makeup as well to see what counts, or if it's better just to set it at an assumed household makeup of 3 to 4 and go from there. But I think that would impact your question as well.
I don't see any other questions.
Okay. The last section is the sustainable site and building guidelines. Again, right now, this is mirroring the one we talked about with chapter 6 on the non-residential, with the exception that we did add in your all's direction, more emphasis on the water quality, the idea of quality, quantity, and runoff rates, and the best management practices, that those should also be opportunities to do things that may or not meet the standards, or things that cause us to look at the standards in a different way. But essentially this section will work the same way as the other ones. At any time we're running into barriers to doing these types of things, we want the code to be flexible, and for staff at the first level to be able to consider an exception to the standard to meet some of these goals. We think a lot of the standards we're putting in are pushing in that direction, but we just want to make sure this is sort of like a safety valve for if they aren't, or if new things arise that push in these directions, make sure we accommodate those as well. If there's no questions on that, that's kind of the end of the presentation. I know, again, I apologize for not having chapter 4 with this, but we'll lump it into the kind of other provisions that we need to be catching up on, and hopefully look for that in the next week or so at least, because it's really close. I just didn't want to get it out with some of the questions I had lingering on and none of them are big picture issues. They're all just making sure it's technically coordinated with the other chapters, but that's the next one to come. And then the last 4 are more catch-alls. And I think, Brian, I don't know if you have any update on the telecommunications might even be leaving altogether from this code and being under the municipal code. So we might do some chapter reshuffling based on that. But that's all I have for tonight. I appreciate everyone's thoughts and discussions. Again, those members that aren't here tonight and are watching the video of it, we'll look forward to your input. And for you all, as you continue to think about these issues, we'll be still collecting feedback, thoughts, and options, and lots of good thoughts already tonight. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Brian, do you have anything to close out?
The only thing I was going to say is that we also plan, once we get through this initial draft, Chris and I have been talking about doing kind of a big recap on these big picture items, and kind of how we've gotten to where we are and what's changed, and how the group has been able to influence some of the recommendation that'll be going forward. So just know that there's still going to be some more work. This isn't the end of it all. There will be a few more bites of the apple going forward. So we appreciate everybody's time, and we look forward to seeing you again real soon.
Oh, Kate?
Sorry, I thought of a question. I was just curious, at the very beginning, it mentioned about the water supply and kind of how we may be planning for that, either from a fire department perspective, or for increasing, the amount of potential units. Is that something, because that's kind of beyond the scope of the land use code, right? Or it's sort of part of, could potentially be part of comprehensive planning, but will there be kind of additional information that would come along with that, or down the road for kind of what we could be expecting?
Yeah, I'll just kind of elaborate on where that issue came up, and maybe someone on staff can say where that information would go. But essentially, we started talking about it in terms of ADUs and additional units, and whether there was any utility issues. And that then escalated into the broader question of, well, if a block has X many number of units, or we have larger scale units, what does that mean to water supply? And so the fire department's observation was, I think it's the 4-inch mains is the key one. And so then planning staff and utilities said, well, we've got maps of all of those of where we have the 4-inch mains. And so people were just curious if those are matching up with where we have the higher density zoning districts. There's really no issues to be concerned with, other than getting the service lines to the buildings, but in overall capacity there is no concerns. And so that's kind of where we left it off. There was a map created to see if if there's an issue. But I think the bigger picture would be, yeah, that if there is, or if as development occurs, there becomes one, it would become part of a larger capital improvement planning. Or in the areas that are deficient, it could be a development code issue, because we do have in there that one of the criteria for platting and redevelopment is existing infrastructure capacity.
And Noel has a question.
When I forgot from earlier, but we had talked about habitable basements and how that might be used to incentivize around the bulk plane, or I guess incentivize in general. Is that something that you looked over, or something that will be in a future point?
Yeah, we did not specifically look at it, other than where I'm most familiar with it having impacts on things in the development code would be sometimes the habitable basements end up raising that floor to get both light for practical purposes, but then to get the necessary egress wells in there. So that's the only real development code issue that I think would be brought up. I am recalling that conversation we had originally, so I might be missing something there, but other than that, we're typically deferring to that as a building code issue. There would be nothing in our code that would prohibit you from doing that. It doesn't necessarily encourage it neither, but the fact that you're going to hit more standards the more you go up, I could see it pushing towards more of those options.
Yeah, it's been a while, but I remember the conversation being that if you put some of your square footage in the basement, that there would be some trade-offs, in terms of, and I think we were talking about lot coverage way back then. I don't know if that's really relevant to that conversation, but things that would, incentivize people to build shorter, but still get that square footage, so that they, are selling at what will make money.
Right, and I do think one of the things I also recall with that conversation was there was something to do with the secondary units as well, as they might have been prohibited in that basement space, which again, this code wouldn't necessarily be doing that either way. It would be deferring to the building code on that, but we can flag that and get with staff and recall that conversation.
And then attached versus detached accessory dwelling units, which might be larger than right now, but because it's in all the tables that you put up, I read it as detached accessory dwelling units, and I don't know if that plays into what we're doing here, or if it could but maybe shouldn't, or where you see that.
No, so that's a good, if you had chapter 4, it would have been able to answer your question. So chapter 4 has the accessory use standards. And so there's 10 things that we're looking at that you currently have them in there now, and we're rolling them in. And one of the things is it does say that the accessory dwelling can be either an attached or detached structure. Now, the issue is if it's attached, it's going to need to meet all the principal building standards as well. It's not additional things. It's treated as one still. With regard to bulk plane height, all that type of stuff. But yeah, we are planning that it could be either option.
Thanks, look forward to it.
Nancy, do we have any other questions?
We don't have any other questions. I'd just like to clarify for the committee, we will not be meeting on November 22nd. That's the week of Thanksgiving. That's all I had.
All right, again, I appreciate everybody's time, and everybody have a great evening, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Good job.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you.